All right, so nominalization. This is actually, one could spend a lot of time on this. One could start the course with a discussion of nominalization because it's perhaps one of the more fundamental structures of Aristotelian language. And the more you think about it, the more you appreciate how deeply rooted what we might call reification, or what we might call, following Whitehead, misplaced concreteness, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, and the fallacy of simple location, how deeply those are rooted in the structure of our grammar, in Aristotelian language, civilization, and therefore how deeply rooted they are in our lives. Life itself is a nominalization. There's so many words, terms, concepts that we have that turn a process into a thing. Look how deeply rooted it is. Even the word process is a nominalization. Even the words that are trying to get away from nominalization are either nominalizations or they're on the edge of nominalization. Hey, the word nominalization itself is a nominalization. There's multi-ordinality for you, or it could be. Space is a nominalization. Time is a nominalization. There's just no escape. Love is a nominalization. Violence, success. My favorite is excellence. Terror, responsibility, beauty, power. Remember early, those of you who were here for first term, I was discussing something very similar from a different angle, talking about how the structure of Aristotelian grammar involves things and relations, or subjects and predicates. The subject is a great big nominalization. I is a nominalization. Yes?
Can etc. be a nominalization?
No.
Okay, thanks. If I just put etc. here, I'll take it off.
But you are pointing to a kind of fuzzy boundary. And that's important too, because not only is nominalization so powerful, but it has a fuzzy boundary which sort of contaminates words that we might think are not nominalizations from across that boundary. Truth is a nominalization. The meta-model, though, was invented by a couple of linguists who didn't want to get involved in this sort of foundational, presuppositional, anti-Aristotelian angle. So they consider nominalizations to be only things that, we can make a distinction, say, between abstract nouns and concrete nouns. Now, I'm saying that concrete nouns are also nominalizations, like the table is a nominalization because it seems solid enough at the object level that once we consider the event level, we know that it's a process. But in the meta-model, the table would be all right because it's a concrete noun. So the meta-model picks only on abstract nouns, and I guess I might as well do the same thing since I'm now doing something. What I'm doing is something like teaching the meta-model. Now, when you recognize one of the meta-model patterns, you have to make a choice. Are you going to challenge it or not? If you challenged all nominalizations, I think you'd end up in jail. So it's a matter of a sort of common sense decision in discourse, when to challenge and when not to challenge a nominalization. And the same goes for your own internal dialogue, because meta-model is perhaps most useful in relation to your own internal dialogue. The nominalization, we're told, is a combination. It's a combination, we're told, of a deletion and an unspecified verb. And it's the only pattern that is a combination of two other patterns. let's take violence, because that's what we're talking about. When we're not talking about the meta model, we're talking about violence right now in this part of the course. So violence is a nominalization. Well, it's not going to it's not going to stop me from going on using the word violence. In fact, I'll be using it a lot. But every time I use it, I will know that it's a nominalization. So, this is related to consciousness of abstraction in the same way. Similar in structure to the whole issue of consciousness of abstraction. So, when I use a word like violence, there's a deletion right away of who is being violent, or what is being violent, because maybe you don't need a person or an animal to be violent. Maybe we can talk about who or what, so those are deleted. And acting violently changes the thing word into a process word. So instead of saying violence, we say acting violently. Now that's kind of clumsy, but the language just isn't flexible enough, for me anyway, to come up with a neologism that is aesthetically tolerable. Like, who is violenting? Who or what specifically is behaving violently, and how specifically? That's really challenging the unspecified verb. How specifically is someone acting violently, or is something acting violently? By the way, the very word being, which Heidegger is using to try and get away from nominalization, is a nominalization. And maybe this affects his entire discourse, his entire Teutonic discourse of capitalized abstract nouns following Hegel. Yes, Daseins. It doesn't escape, as a matter of fact. It might even collude in its own undermining. It might even somehow escape the effort to undermine it as a nominalization. I digress a little bit. One of the big differences between Hinduism and Buddhism is that Hinduism works a lot with the nominalization self, or Atman. And Buddhism, being a kind of Protestant revolution against Hinduism, goes for Anatman, or no self. So Buddhism is kind of noun-busting. Challenging nominalization is noun-busting. You're busting nouns. Busting nouns. Anatman attempts to bust the noun of Atman, no self. But hey, that's a nominalization too. No self also can easily become a nominalization. But that was a digression. Some languages, we're told, either have only happening words or have many, many more happening words than Indo-European languages do. For example, you may have come across this example before. If we say, "It is raining," is there a problem?
Just want to turn this a little bit down.
Yeah.
I'm just trying a little bit.
Much better.
If we say, "It is raining," we're presupposing a reified subject that is doing the action, but there's no reified subject doing the action. It's just the action, raining. So we're told that there are some languages that don't say rain or it is raining. We're told that there are some languages that just say raining. Instead of saying it is snowing, what is this it that is snowing? Instead of saying it is snowing, we just say snowing. I think maybe Benjamin Lee Worf, in his classic, which is not even forgotten, it's one of the few classics that is not forgotten, Language and Reality, might discuss some languages that have this kind of a structure rather than the subject-predicate or thing relations structure of Aristotelian language. Benjamin Lee Worf. So when we challenge the nominalization, we recover the deletion if necessary. We change the thing word into a process word or phrase, and we find out how specifically, how specifically the evil Serbs are acting violently. Right? Yes, it's important to do this every time I write here, and that's a universal quantifier, right? Every time, and it's challenged by asking every time, and the answer is no, as I just said a few minutes ago, not every time, because I'm going to be using nominalizations myself quite frequently, especially the nominalization violence. But here's some examples. Truth, okay? How do you challenge it? You ask who specifically, acting or speaking or writing truthfully, and how specifically. That's very clumsy. But, there's no escape. Truth. Well, who specifically? Truthing. Let's try that one. Truthing. In what way specifically, or how specifically truthing? And then you get, lower down the structural differential, you get what Grinder calls higher quality information, what Korzybski would call closer to the object level. I don't get any recognition. Lots of words that end, there's lots of words ending in shun. Don't get no satisfaction, don't get no recognition. You could challenge that by asking, you don't have to recover the deletion because it's I who don't get any recognition. So you could say something like, who would you like to be recognized by? Because that is deleted. And how specifically would you like to be recognized? So recognition becomes the action of being recognized, and by whom and how specifically. I regret my decision. Decision is a nominalization. I have a hard time with decision. A lot of people say that. I have a hard time with decision. You could ask, so that's what you've decided? I have a lot of anxiety is probably our favorite word. You think of anxiety as a thing, and that it can be quantified, and you talk about your anxiety level as though you could simply have a thermometer that would measure your anxiety level. So you could challenge that by asking, so you often feel anxiously? How specifically do you feel anxiously? And, or how specifically do you experience that? That's a bit fudgy. And when and where, a therapist might ask you, oh, where do you feel that in your body? That would be getting right down into the object level. What would you have to do inside your head in order to get to feel that in your body? Would be a nice therapeutic question about anxiety. Of course, all these nominalizations are also elementalistic. Right? So when you're challenging nominalization, you're undermining elementalism, and you're also bringing the date right into the heart of the matter, the date, because every nominalization eternalizes. That's part of reification. Every nominalization makes eternal, that which is actually happening. I suffer from depression. Okay, there's just no end to it. So I'll let that complete the list of metamodel patterns, but I'm going to go through and give some more examples of some of the patterns. I'm just going to go through the list now to remind you of what they are, and for some of them give another example or two. Here's a little statement. Here's a little bit of patriotism, okay? We must maintain the honor of our nation even if we die in the process. Modal operator. We must maintain the honor of our nation even if we die in the process. Well, that's, as they say, privileging honor, or valorizing honor, perhaps above all other virtues. Is virtue in normalization? Yes. Hold on. So the challenge would be, what would the challenge be, Laura? The challenge, we must maintain the honor of our nation even if we die in the process. The challenge would be, well, what would happen if we didn't? And if you talk to a patriot in this way and you ask what would happen if we didn't, if he or she could stand it to consider the question, then you would learn a lot about the actual happenings that patriots fear would ensue closer to the object level if we did not value the virtue of the honor of our nation practically above all other virtues. So it's not, as I said before, it's not necessarily, the term challenge itself is maybe a little bit of a mistake, but it helps to play the meta-model game to think of it in terms of challenge and response. But truly, fundamentally, what you're trying to do is not to undermine, but to elicit, as I said before, higher quality information, both in self and in other. I love this one because I hate it. You could ask me what it is about it that I hate, but this is a very Burkean kind of sentiment which one could find in many discourses. And it's not patriotic, it's spiritual. The universe is so beautiful that we must love and reverence it. Now this one's packed full of possibilities for challenge. First of all, the universe. What kind of pattern is that?
Well, it's an unspecified referential index.
Okay, that's true. It is. I guess it is. I was thinking of it because lots of these can be classified under more than one pattern.
Is it a universal quantifier?
Yeah. Universal quantifier. Universe. It's a universal quantifier. So where is this universe that is so beautiful, like out there, that we over here must love and reverence it? The universe is an elementalistic term. World is an elementalistic term. Cosmos is an elementalistic term, but we're not going to get hung up here on that again. It's so beautiful. What pattern is that? The universe is so beautiful.
Nominalization, right?
No,
Oh,
beautiful is
fine.
not a noun, it's a predicate. So it's an unspecified verb. Unspecified verb refers to both verbs and predicates, like adjectives. So, but, that's true. But more importantly than that, it's a lost performative, if you ask me. The universe is so beautiful. According to whom is it so beautiful? And according to what criteria is it so beautiful? Granted that there is such an it as the universe. And what if I said the universe is so ugly that we must hate and despise it? Is that on the face of it and not at the sort of same level of subjectivity? Do we have to choose either to love or to hate the universe? Can't we just be the universe? It's kind of a Zen response that we must love and reverence it. Well, love is an unspecified verb. How specifically must we love it? Reverence, it's a nominalization also. And reverence is nominalization, unspecified verb. Well, how specifically should we reverence? Revere it. Burke has an answer as to how you should revere it. You should revere it by knowing your place and revering your betters. And there's other forms of answer, and they're all equally bullshit if you ask me. But the modal operator, you must. But that's my opinion. But the modal operator is must. So you ask, okay, what would happen if we didn't love and reverence the universe, even if it is so beautiful? What is this must? Okay. Then there was mind reading. There's complex equivalence. Here's a complicated little complex equivalence that I thought I might share with you. I used to like to read, having read leftist stuff all my life, I got to the point where I could sort of predict every word that I was going to hear or read. So I started reading rightist stuff, and I'm getting to the point where I can more or less predict everything I'm going to hear or read over there too. But there's a quite intelligent conservative Catholic journal called First Things, whose editor, Richard Newhouse, was quite intellectual. He just died. And he had a little piece in there in October 2002 about abortion. And he was trying to convince me, by using this kind of Aristotelian hyphen Aquinas and Aquinian
I think it's
syllogism.
Thomist.
Sorry?
I think there is Thomas.
Oh, they are Thomists, for sure, very Thomist. So he's like this. If it's not a potential human being, it's not a human being. First he establishes that. If it's not a potential human being, it's not a human being. And then his next step in reasoning is, so, if it is a potential human being, in other words, a fertilized ovum, it is a human being. Now, what pattern is that? It's complex equivalence. It's right there in the if. It's a double complex equivalence. If it's not a potential human being, it's not a human being. So, if it is a potential human being, it is a human being. That's not even good Aristotelian logic, because first thing I learned in second year logic was that you can't convert an A prop. You can't turn a proposition around like that in the way that he just did. But it's okay. Maybe it's a sacred mystery. I mean, First Things is a Catholic journal, and at the end of the day, what we have is sacred mystery, so why not there? I don't want to be too snarky about it. But anyway, you would challenge it. Is it possible that even though it's true that if it's not a potential human being, it's not a human being, nevertheless, it is perhaps also true that even if it is a potential human being, it's not a human being. And if you can't follow that, that's because he was just trying to confuse you in the first place, so the challenge has to be equally confusing. Let me end with a simplification coming from one of our great postmodern simplifiers, Richard Rorty. Richard Rorty says, no one will ever settle the question of when human life begins. It's blah, blah. That question is blah, blah. No one will ever settle the question of when human life begins. Hey, you could say it begins with the Big Bang. Or you could say it begins in the primordial swamp. Anyway, no one can settle the question of when human life begins. Better to look at the actual experiences of parents and infants, says Rorty. Almost as if he's been sneaking a look at science and sanity. But of course, he is the last pragmatist. And that's a very pragmatic way of dealing with this issue. And of course, if you wanted to think about the connections between general semantics and pragmatic philosophy, you could spend a lot of time doing that. Okay. Lost performative. I should be better at this, according to what criteria that I have adopted. Should I be better at this? I mentioned before Albert Ellis talks a lot about shoulding on yourself. So shoulding on yourself involves modal operators, because that's what should is. It's a modal operator, but it's also lost performative. According to what criteria? And, there can be an answer. Okay, enough. I love the meta model, but I know that a lot of people think that I make a meta fetish out of it. If you're not basically a verbal kind of person, you don't like the meta model. So this is one way of finding out if you're basically a verbal person or not.
I'm not.
University is a nominalizer. When you hear somebody say, the university has decided, I mean, we live in a university, so we're a little bit suspicious when we hear that anyway. We're asking, like, who specifically are you talking about that made this decision? Who specifically is engaged in this ongoing process of decision-making? You see what's happening, Shannon, as I take that apart?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good example.
But people who don't live in the university, when they're told, the university has revealed or something like that, they really have this sort of image of a certain, almost like person wearing a white coat, kind of divine person issuing, findings. Findings? Is finding a nominalization? It's one of those fuzzy words on the border. Okay, now, so now we're talking about violence. And I promised I would channel Harold Popinski to the best of my ability to introduce this matter. No, he's not a Jew. Mennonite. And the Mennonites have, among their contributions to civilization, because they're pacifists. And, you know, even more serious about it than the Quakers, I think. So one of the operations of the Mennonite Church, if we can call it that, is peacemaking. And one of the branches of peacemaking is peacemaking criminology. And Popinski sort of specialized in peacemaking criminology. And he wrote a little book called The Abstract Geometry of Violence and Democracy. The Abstract Geometry of Violence and Democracy, in which he decides how are we going to use these terms, these nominalizations. Democracy is a big nominalization. So the question is, how are we going to use these terms? When somebody asks, what is democracy? You translate it, how are we going to use this term democracy? Because it's a formulation, not a thing. Democracy, it's a formulation, not a thing. So when we talk about democracy, we're deciding how to use the term. How are we going to use that word democracy in relation to what? He wants to use the term democracy, and I go along with him a long, long way. He wants to use it as the opposite of violence. So democracy is the opposite of violence. So Popinski is saying democracy is nonviolence. And I'm close to adopting that as a kind of rubric for the second part of the course. And that's Radical General Semantics. Because, let's put it this way, let's put it in terms of listening. If democracy is listening to all, I'm not totally happy with this, but as we go along, problems will come up with the idea of listening to all. But for now, let's just say democracy is listening to all. Then violence is not listening. It is coercing, not listening. It is dominating, not listening. It's being non-responsive to the other rather than responsive to the other. So Popinski also uses this language of responsiveness to the other as a kind of synonym for democracy. Now, Pericles would have disagreed. And, I guess those ancient Greeks got to define democracy in a fundamental way that's hard to shake. It was quite compatible for them with war-making, etc., 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 wasn't it? And this is going on.
But it was only war-making on non-democrats.
The Internationale is a war song. So it just goes far, and right and left. And it goes, so Popinski says, war is violence, and crime is violence, and tyranny is violence, and punishment is violence. I'm going to zero in on that one soon. Punishment is violence. And he says it's based on the belief, let's call it a modal operator, that offenders must be hurt. Offenders, unspecified referential index, but it's okay. Offenders, those who offend against us, or if you like to put it in more abstract terms, those who offend against justice, freedom, democracy, those who offend against God's laws, those who offend against whatever. Those who offend must be hurt. Must be hurt. Offenders must be hurt in order to teach them a lesson. Now, of course, if you burn them at the stake, then the lesson is being learned by their immortal soul. It makes more sense for the Inquisition to think of it in those terms than for us. Hurt in order to teach them a lesson, but really, because we know damn well that it's a very, very poor way of teaching a lesson, punishment. We know it, that it's a very poor way of teaching a lesson. So at the bottom line, we punish because we believe that offenders should get what they deserve. Or that we, the victims, should get what we deserve, e.g. closure, which used to be known as revenge. So instead of calling it revenge now, we call it closure. There's a very tight link that's been tightening for the past 20 years. You can see it in the criminal justice process between vengeance and closure. And if you don't hurt the offender, you are re-victimizing, to coin a phrase, the victim. Teach them a lesson, give them what they deserve, as opposed to restorative justice, I think. You know, if I were an expert in this field, I would want to go into the study of restorative justice substantially more than I have already, and make it even more restorative than it is now. But we've all sort of heard about the idea of restorative justice and what's involved in that. So some forgiveness might be involved in that. Restitution might be involved in that. Restoring a kind of more harmonious relationship among the so-called offender and the so-called victim is aspects of what are involved there. Now, while I was writing this page years ago, I came across a little story in I magazine. And someone was joking, neo-Nazi scientists have cloned Hitler. He's already 9 years old. I gave you a little picture of Hitler as a baby last time. He's 3 or 4, I think, in that picture, so now he's 9. Hitler is already 9 years old. He's in Argentina, right? And he's 9 years old, and he's already plotting world domination.
Oh.
And it goes on, nothing a good caning wouldn't cure. This was when the stories about caning that is used as an efficient deterrent of spitting and gum chewing in Singapore, that was all in use there. So nothing a good caning wouldn't cure. But so here's my comment. But it was caning that helped to make Hitler. Okay? Hitler does not appear out of the blue. Hitler has many, 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 many causes. Many, 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 many causes, which makes him the perfect scapegoat, because you can roll all those causes into Hitler. And one of the causes of Hitler was caning, because I get this from reading a few biographies of him, but we don't have to read biographies of him. It could distract us maybe a little bit from our scapegoating, our desire, our lust for scapegoating. Caned frequently by his father, and when he was a little kid, being caned by his father, he vowed, according to my sources, not to cry and not to bend and not to run in the face of extreme physical pain. He made that vow. And that's one of the vows that makes the man. It's one of the vows that makes the man. So say, hey, we're not talking about Hitler now anymore. We're talking about the man. It's one of the vows that makes the man. And, you know, I'm not saying that it's wrong or evil or something like that. If you're being caned by your father, I think it's an appropriate vow to make. I would have wanted to make it myself. My father had caned me, but he had more subtle forms of punishment. So, you know, and then in World War I, he was caned by the Allies. Together with the whole German people, he was caned by the Allies, the victorious Allies, and then they were all caned by the Treaty of Versailles. And Hitler himself was blinded for 24 hours by poison gas in the trenches in World War I. So we begin to see the making of a Hitler.
I think he spent a year in hospital recovering from that.
Is that a fact?
Yeah, it was like a year before he had his full sight back.
So he had time to think.
Oh yeah.
Was he thinking sanely? No. He's thinking maybe about the Jewish doctor who failed to cure his mother of her cancer, stuff like that. It's really a fascinating biography. I mean, you didn't have to have a mother who was failed by her Jewish doctor in order to be an anti-Semite in the German-speaking world in the late 20s and early 30s, but it helped. Growing up in Vienna helped, because anti-Semitism was born in Vienna. I mean, vicious biological anti-Semitism was born in Vienna, as was psychoanalysis, as was Zionism. They were all born in Vienna, modern Zionism.
Who are you thinking of, Gavin, when you say that vicious anti-Semitism was born?
The first mayor, the famous mayor of Vienna, named, I think his name was Luger, was the first politician to run on an anti-Semitic platform and to succeed in the history of Europe. It's not as though the Jews didn't give cause for concern. You know, I mean, anti-Semitism is always partly based on misbehavior of the Jews. And of course, any subtle anti-Semite knows enough to say something like Louis Farrakhan, I don't attack all Jews, I just attack the Jews who do evil. Violence breeds violence, grows by being passed on, and that's the only way it grows, says Penske, by being passed on. And it can be passed on in many ways, of course, from extreme physical violence all the way to extremes of insult and opprobrium. Because we know as human beings that insult is violent. In fact, the word insult itself means hurt. Insult. Talked a little bit about that last time. And so Popensky goes on, and the logic is ironclad, and it's both Aristotelian and non-Aristotelian. Yes, such things can happen. It can be abated, says Popensky. He's no utopian. He doesn't say abolished. It can be abated only by confronting it with its opposing force, which is responsiveness. And so then we equate responsiveness with democracy. So we're strengthening this identification of democracy with nonviolence and responsiveness. To the other, and as we'll see later, maybe next week or the week after that, when I talk about the internal relations of the self with itself, also responsible to parts of the self that are being humiliated, shamed, etc., and that are not acceptable to the self. And my main source there is going to be Jung. And yes, maybe Jung did sympathize with the Nazis, but he was that, etc. Freud didn't think he was such a bad guy. So tyranny, war, crime, and punishment all presuppose and require the belief that violence is necessary. Necessary. And by the way, I'm not here to say that it's not necessary. I'm not here to say that it's not necessary. I'm here to inquire as to the sources and causes of this necessity, and to inquire whether these sources and causes are, to crib from Marcuse, aspects of basic repression or of surplus repression. So I'm not saying that today we should go out there and empty the prisons. No. What about next week? We could start next week. We could start next week by releasing all those who are offended for possession or trafficking in drugs. We could start that way. 2/3 of them would be out. Small crimes, crimes against small property the following week. 1/3 prison population would be left. I'm just guessing. So, I once took an introductory political course from Alan Bloom, who was a great lecturer. He had a fantastic sense of humor, and he was really good as a Straussian on certain aspects of political theory. Machiavelli, they love Machiavelli for a number of different reasons, and so there was a close reading of the text of The Prince, which is a small text, and it's fun for the kids to get into it as an introduction to modern political theory. So Bloom asked once in lecture, do you know how many times the word necessita is used in The Prince? And nobody knew. And old-fashioned teacher would have said, go home and read The Prince and come back next week and tell me how many times the word violence is used.
Violenza.
Which would be necessity, necessita. How many times the word necessity is used?
Necessita.
Necessita. Good. Okay. So, it's complex equivalence, mind reading, cause effect. It's something like this. If we don't hang shepherd boys who steal a loaf of bread, which was one of the forms punishment took in our past in Europe, and virtuous, spiritual, religious, compassionate, wonderful people never thought to challenge the fact that a shepherd boy who stole a sheep would be hung. They just took it for granted. So the question arises, well, what are we taking for granted in the same way that they took that for granted? So what is this necessity? There's a nominalization. Let's look into it. Well, the answer would be, in those days, I guess, the economy would crumble. And that remains one of the answers to the question, what would happen if we didn't punish the offender? Well, the economy, look at the looting in Haiti and the kind of excessive to our mind punishment of looters of looters of a bicycle wheel or whatever, shot in the back. Well, why is that? Necessita. If you ask the shooter, necessita. Give them a finger, they want the whole head, and other versions of necessita.
For the future, I don't have it on me right now.
Yeah.
But I think a good news article for this segment of the class would actually be an incident in Texas a few years ago where two kids, about 13, broke into a fellow's trailer, stole some snack food, chips and that. He came home, overpowered them, apparently forced them to kneel, and shot one of them in the back. And he was found not guilty because of defending his home.
To us, this is excessive.
Yes.
True. The question I'm also raising is, and what are we doing, and what are we doing that we don't think is excessive?
Well, that's the thing. Everyone in Texas is defending this.
Next week or the week after that, we'll talk about these kids in Britain who were murderers. But it's not enough for the Sen to call them murderers. They got to be monsters, so they've just been released, by the way, and the English people are shivering in their boots because someone say something?
Yeah, neat. I didn't know they just been released.
Yeah, they're a lot older now. So the question is, how does it get to be necessary? Let's say, if it is necessary, at times in certain contexts, if it is, then the question is, how does it get to be necessary? Well, the traditional conservative hyphen liberal answer, because it's an answer that some liberals also give, is that man is innately violent and must be tamed by violent means. So violent must be violated, and this hurts me more than it hurts you. Orzybski said, jails for the animal, churches for the soul. At the bottom, here's the bottom line, at the bottom are presuppositions about the requirements of survival. So we get down to survival. Pipinski, well, let's see. Man is an irrational animal with a rational soul thrown in. The rational soul must discipline the irrational animal or tame it. He says, we can't separate the criminal from our understanding of the criminal. So there he offers what we've been calling a kind of Mobius. Here's the criminal. Here's our understanding of the criminal. And he's saying we can't separate the criminal from our understanding of the criminal. That includes war criminal. We can't separate the criminal from our understanding of the criminal. That means the more we look into the criminal, the more we find our understanding of the criminal. The other side is easier to get. And he goes on and says, understanding, first he establishes, we can't separate the criminal from our understanding of the criminal. This is the abstract geometry of violence and democracy. Understanding requires a commitment to feeling the offender's pain. Now, you might feel a little pain at hearing this formulation, feeling the offender's pain, because there's so much bullshit out there about feeling our pain and feeling your pain. There's so much hypocrisy in most uses of that formulation, but it's true. You can't understand without empathy. So you could put understanding and empathy also on the Mobius. You can't understand the other without feeling his or her pain. And he goes on, or you could put it, less definitively this way: how the other behaves is not separable from how we behave in relation to the other. And that applies right across the board, universal quantifier. Okay? You can never separate how the other behaves from how I behave in relation to the other, and later on in the course you'll have an optional task where you can work with that on the ground. One cannot so easily continue to hurt another human being while feeling and responding to his pain, says Popinski. Notice, it might sound like an extreme formulation, but he's being kind of careful. He's saying one cannot so easily continue to hurt another human being while feeling and responding to his pain. Which brings us to Debs. Well, whom I've already talked about him a bit. I nominated him for President of the United States in 2008. Posthumously. And, who knows what a guy like Debs would do if he was faced with the responsibilities of power. I don't know. So he was, in my opinion anyway, the greatest U.S. socialist leader, ran for president several times before World War I. He once got 1 million votes, which was a lot of votes in the United States. There were a lot of Europeans not yet assimilated. They were the main source of his vote, I think. But there were also Native Americans who went for Eugene Debs, Oklahoma farmers, miners in Oregon, Washington, places like that. And his last campaign was run from his jail cell. His only book, as I said before, was called Walls and Bars, and you can get it on Amazon. And it's not a great work of literature, but it is a great work. It's not a great work of theory or literature or anything. It's just a great work. Coming from him at the time in the way that it came from him at the time is what makes it a great work. You've heard the cliche, stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron walls a cage. Well, I don't know who wrote that first, but it sounds a little Shakespearean, doesn't it? But for Debs it was true. He went in there, he was there for 3 years, and while he was in there he made a lot of friends. And when he made friends, he made them among all classes of prisoners. He just didn't make friends with poor, oppressed, politically oppressed people. He made friends with all people. He made friends with businessmen who were in there for white-collar crimes. Right? He was in prison, of course, for opposing the war, for failing to support the troops in 1918. You could go to prison for that then. And in his statement before sentencing, this is what he said. And I'm picking this out because I want it to resonate with stuff that I've already said before when talking about multi-ordinal levels of self. He said, Your Honor, years ago I made up my mind that I was not one whit better than the meanest man on earth. Marx didn't say it, Engels didn't say it, and Lenin didn't say it, and Gramsci, who was in prison also, didn't say it. Debs said it. I made up my mind that I was not one whit better than the meanest man on earth. Notice he doesn't speak of equality. He proceeds without any measure of the worth of human beings. He doesn't say all human beings are equally worthy. He puts it negatively. I am not one whit better than the meanest man on earth. It's a very non-Aristotelian sort of negative way of putting it. And he goes on to say, the very lowest and most degenerate of criminals. You can't get any more extreme than that. Charles Manson, whoever your favorite monster is, Debs is saying the very lowest and most degenerate of criminals, and he's not sparing the terms lowest and degenerate. He's using those terms. And yet in the next breath he says, is not one whit worse than I. Helps to being a Christian, maybe. We both did the best we could, he says, and the worst. We both did the best we could and the worst. So that reminds me of what I was preaching here about, you know, if you had been conceived with the same genetic material, etc., etc. And it reminds me of what I was saying here about whatever person, given the resources at her disposal at the moment and given all of the contextual circumstances, did the very best she could at that moment. That's what it brings to mind. So Debs already knows this. Whether he knew it before he got into prison or not is not clear to me. But if he didn't know it before going to prison, he learned it in prison. And who knows what Conrad Black is learning in prison. But, you know, his prison is kind of a resort compared to the one that Debs was in. That's my impression. By the way, it's nice to know that Debs, after the war, was Woodrow Wilson, the great liberal progressive Democrat, refused to pardon him. And that Debs was pardoned by the Republican conservative president, Warren G. Harding. A little confusion is salutary for our polarization of left and right very often. And then he goes, and this is the famous line that we have here. But you don't see this very often. I mean, I came across this poster on Google, and it's put out by a tiny outfit called Books to Prisoners. It sends books to prisoners. Listen and let this resonate with stuff we already know as general semanticists, and then we'll see some radical general semantics happening. While there is a lower class, I am in it. Not I am for it. I am in it. While there is a criminal element, he says, I am of it. None of this easy separation of lower class from criminal. And while there is a soul in jail, in prison, I am not free. A soul, not a virtuous soul, not an innocent soul, not a proletarian soul, not a progressive soul, not a victim soul, not a black soul, not an Islamic soul, just a soul. While there is a soul in prison, I am not free. Why do I have to emphasize this here today? We focusing on prison as a racist institution. Okay, so if we could make it a bastion of racial equality, would it then be all right? Or then many, many people like to point out the way that the law favors the rich over the poor, so if the rich were punished as viciously as the poor, would that make it all right? I mean, liberalism really has sunk to its depths on this issue, like along these lines that I'm talking about, and socialism no better. Yeah.
You'll be pleased to find out, Gab, that about 15 years ago, a French intellectual wrote a book called A World Without Prisons.
A world without prisons?
Yeah,
and of course there's Foucault, too.
Yeah. It's Albert Jacquard, who's actually, I believe, a geneticist.
A what?
He works on genetics.
Right, and what's his name again?
Jacquard.
I'll ask you about him again later.
Sure.
But to work on genetics is actually an interesting way of
Yeah.
approaching this conclusion. So these words he doesn't separate himself from them. He doesn't separate himself from them at all. It's like, well, I won't go any further except to say these words are poetic, but not hyperbolic. I mean, it sounds like a big exaggeration. It sounds like hyperbole. But it's not. In my opinion, it's not hyperbole. It's just literally, factually true. Those words of Debs. Especially the first set, where he says he's no better or worse. And, you know, we can drag Marx in to support the argument. He said, man is the ensemble of social relations. Every Marxist learns this and parrots it like as part of the catechism. Man is the ensemble of social relations. So if you take that seriously, don't you arrive immediately at these conclusions? If you take it seriously. Man is the ensemble of social relations. Well, Well then, so what now? Debs doesn't say, while there is an innocent soul in jail, I am not free. So I come back to that. He doesn't say, while there is an innocent soul in jail, I am not free. He says, while there is a soul in jail, I'm not free. If Milosevic had lived to go to jail, instead of outsmarting everyone by dying in the middle of the trial. So here's an example of listening from a book called Women in Conflict with the Law by Evelyn K. Summers, U of T Press, not too long ago. Nor would she dare to suggest simply letting them out, but she does go in there to do her research and listen to them. Women in conflict with the law have their own ideas about why and how they became lawbreakers. Experts tell us who these women are, is of identity, and why they break the law, usually ignoring or discrediting outright the opinions of the women themselves. As a counseling research intern in a women's prison, she heard stories of dozens of inmates, and the vast majority are in for prostitution, drug abuse, and theft. Let them all out. All. Tomorrow you could do that. And, you know, I'm not saying that after they go out you should just put them on the streets to fend for themselves. I didn't say that. And there's physical assaults and arson. I mean, physical assaults are nothing much. It depends. Anyway, their stories call into question, she says, existing theoretical explanations for criminal behavior, as well as the explanations commonly heard in the day-to-day discourse of the prison. It's not enough to go and ask, well, what are you in for, etc. You got to go into a kind of depth interviewing mode or something like that. Summers presents 14 women's accounts of their actions, thoughts, and feelings without excusing or condemning them, and without molding their expectations to some model. In other words, close to the object level and far from the higher levels of abstraction. 4 common things emerged. Need, not told what kinds of need, I guess all kinds of need can happen there. Disconnection and the influence of others. Alienation. Anger and fear. Anger and fear. Survival. Remember, we got to survival a minute ago. Anger and fear. Soon we'll be taking a depth psychological dip into survival, anger, and fear. Of course, there's no need for a similar orientation to low-life men in prison, as by a little masculinist comment. Maybe it's footnote. Alberta jails a few years ago took away the color TV. They put in black and white TV in Alberta jails.
Can you still buy black and white TV?
They got them. 100 years after Emma Goldman, Alberta takes the color TV out, puts in small black and white TVs. And because that's all they deserve. Dessert, of course. The non-edible kind is a large part of this. And as the minister responsible said at the time, we're not running a Holiday Inn. Now notice the title of that work by Summers I was just quoting. It's called Women in Conflict with the Law. It's not called Criminal Women. It's not called Bad Women. There's a redefinition of crime coming out of that title. The title redefines crime as conflict with the law. Okay, is that closer to the object world? A less challengeable, lost performative? By the way, why are we talking about criminology? Isn't this a political theory course? Just kidding. Have you come across this extended a discussion of criminology anywhere in your career so far?
No.
And will you come across it again?
Well, if I
future
go
of
into
their
law
career.
school,
In law school, yeah. Good luck.
it just won't be quite as detailed or at all useful.
Right. All right, so that's the approach of peacemaking and other radical criminologists. Relabeling crime. So we're down here at the object level, we're listening to women, etc., 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 etc. We go into prison with Debs, we come out. Having had these experiences, we go up the levels of the structural differential and reformulate at a higher label level crime. In fact, we dispense with the term crime. We don't put it in quotes or index or date or anything like that. Simply, we just abolish crime. Now, is it a crime to abolish crime? I mean, the category of crime. It's going to be redefined as conflict. But, before we get there, Popinski and others often point out, but without much result, that the pain inflicted on criminals, the hurt inflicted on criminals in order to teach them a lesson, or because they deserve it, or because we need closure, also affects their families, like the mother of the murderer. She gets a nod. Friends, it affects their family and friends. It reverberates. The punishment of the criminal reverberates through his or her social networks. And where does the reverberation stop? I think Popinski, somewhere in his book, has a geometrical or algebraic model for this reverberation of punishment throughout the whole social fabric. You think about that. You feel it. It reverberates throughout society. And you can't draw a line around the violence done to the lawbreaker and say, it ends there. Popinski et al. Argue that there is something wrong, I would say unseen, with the very category of crime. So just as we are practicing saying racialization instead of race, we could practice saying criminalization instead of crime, but it doesn't go far enough, because usually when people say criminalization, they mean that things that should not be criminalized are criminalized, and other things should be criminalized, and that's okay. So it's not going to do the same kind of work as the reformulation, racialization. Instead of making out some kinds of human conflict as crime, marking out some kind of human conflict as crime to be dealt with by police, courts, and prisons, an immense industry, as we know, and a lot of critique now focuses on the industrialization of it, as if it were not industrialized, it would be okay. Privatization, so if it was not privatized, it would be okay. All kinds of features of the system are focused on by reformers, but the system itself is like, okay, please, we can't go there. We're revolutionary radicals. Maybe 100 years after the revolution, when the state is withered away. 1,000 years after that. You remember the moment in Soviet history where Nikita Khrushchev declared that the state had withered away? Yeah. And then when pressed on it, it was like, well, it hadn't actually totally withered away, but the process was well underway.
Yeah, he said within 50 years.
Within 50 years?
It'll be completely gone.
All right.
And it is! The Soviet state is completely gone.
Right. So there would be a radical shift, according to the peacemaking criminologists, away from crime and punishment towards the search for ways of resolving conflicts and altering the social situations that give rise to conflict. Restorative justice is one of those projects. I think a rather timid one, actually, but I can't suggest amendments. Ways of resolving conflicts and altering the social situations that give rise to conflict, and that's peacemaking. That's what peacemaking is. So there are already clues about how to do this in the practices of Aboriginals, the little bits of which have been adopted in the actually existing so-called justice system. But what I've noticed is the consensus now is that restorative justice should only be used in cases which hardly amount to anything very serious anyway. So it's not actually doesn't work towards abolishing punishment. It works towards extending the range of quantities and qualities of punishment which serve to hold the whole system in place, which liberal reforms so often do. Okay, so you could release most of them tomorrow morning, and then we could think about what to do with the rest. And that would be, we could call it a sanity amnesty. Next, I have 2 bits from radical criminology works, because there's another kind of radical criminology besides the peacemaking criminology, and that's the radical criminology that emphasizes research on the connections between crime and social structure. So Foucault was a radical criminologist of some kind, not a peacemaking criminologist. So this is from a book called The Politics of Redress. The Politics of Redress, by William de Haan. Probably Dutch, I guess the most progressive prison systems in the world are probably in Northern Europe, especially Norway. I think I read once that in Norway there's an annual conference of people involved in the prison system, including convicts.
Mm-hmm. And their incarceration rate is very, very low.
Very low, I'm sure. When Princess Grace married Prince Rainier of Monaco, they declared a celebratory monarchist amnesty. They released the prison population of Monaco, which was 1.
What was he in for?
Les Majestés. So, more or less paraphrasing from this book, the criminal justice system has no capacity for conflict resolution. It's an ideological apparatus for consolidating power and morality, which denies the legitimacy of a whole series of alternatives which should be taken into consideration. In the conventional view, he says, which I would call Aristotelian, in the conventional view, if there's harm done somewhere, let's see if we can make it a criminal matter. Find some individuals to label criminals and make them the essential targets of all efforts at amelioration of the crime problem. Page 3. Page 158, an alternative. Redress. Inaugurate an open discussion about how an unfortunate event should be viewed and what the appropriate response ought to be. Does it sound more democratic? Does it sound like it's closer to people's experiences at the object level? Is it not relevant to general semantics? Is it not radical general semantics? To advocate redress is to call for real dialogue among all interested parties. All interested parties, so it becomes, it could become a pretty large group. All sorts of practical difficulties are occurring to you, of course. Attending fully to the particular interests, histories, loyalties, capacities, fears, and aspirations of all individuals involved. Attending fully, listening, that's my word. He says, attending fully to the particular interests, histories, loyalties, capacities, fears, aspirations, etc. of all individuals involved. Is it close enough to the object? Can you get any closer? Justice might finally be done, says de Haan, to the complexity of human action and social events. So what the criminal justice system does as one of the fundamental, if not the fundamental pillar of the Aristotelian regime is to simplify the complexity of conflict. But how unrealistic would it be to put a high priority on such reform? We've got other fish to fry, to coin a phrase. Terrorism, Zionism, war on drugs, war on Afghanistan, war in Iraq. And this is from another book by a radical criminologist. This one of them sounds suspiciously Serb. So already his theory is in doubt. You know, he could have been an ethnic cleanser.
You could have been a Croat too.
He could have been a Croat.
Can't tell between the names.
Tell me what you think of this name, Dragan Milovanovic. Milovanovic? Is that Serb or Croat? Or
There's no
could
distinction.
be anything.
Although Dragan is apparently more common among Serbs as a name, as a first name, but it really could be.
Okay, Dragan Milovanovic and Stuart Henry. They wrote a book, well, this is actually an article in a journal called Criminology, volume 29, number 2, 1999, page 299. The very categorization of the diversity of human conflicts and transgressions as crimes of various categorizations. Okay, categorization at the label level, the very categorization of the diversity of human conflicts and transgressions. I'm just thinking about the son of a friend of mine once had a domestic dispute with what they call a domestic dispute with his. Was she already his wife? Probably, because most of these things happen after rather than before marriage. So she hit him over the head with a frying pan, and he was sent to anger management training. You figure it out. As when various disputes, so it's coming up right now, as when various disputes between family members are described under the unifying term domestic violence or spousal abuse, the complexity of the human condition is given a static, that is no date, decontextualized, that is no chain index, meaning to enable controllers to better negotiate routine cases. So we have to categorize types of cases, make up rules about how to manage them. That is, the controllers have to do that. We're going to study how to do that.
I will.
If you go into criminal law.
You probably wouldn't. But
I mean, let's punish corporate malefactors. How much noise I've heard on the left these days about, don't punish the people, punish the corporate criminals. Punish, punish, punish. What is that, some kind of Gramscian war of position? Are you trying to get on the good side, the working class, by advocating the punishment of corporate criminals? Don't you think the working class is smart enough to figure out that when you take power, they'll be next? Abandon the crime script, suggests this team. Construct a new script, the aim of which would be to reduce the suffering of everyone, thus transforming the totality of relations of which it is a part. Thus transforming the totality of relations of which it is a part. I mean, leftist strategists might condemn such an approach as utopian. And you've got to start, where people are at, and where people are at is seeking vengeance. So we'll go along with where people are at, and as we're doing that, we can actually become vengeance seekers ourselves if we weren't already that to begin with. The next bit is called Justify My Hate, based, of course, on the Madonna song Justify My Love. But you see, hate actually doesn't seem to need as much justification as love does. It's very weird. It's because of the close relationship that we assume exists between hate and justice. Isn't it? It's like, sometimes when the nominalization justice is used, it's a kind of synonym for vengeance. And how could there be vengeance without hate? If there were no hate, could there be vengeance? We're giving them what they deserve. Justify My Hate, and the subtitle is The Projection of Evil. So this is where we get into depth psychology. I'm using projection here in the depth psychological sense, as when something in me is not experienced as being in me, it's experienced as being in you. So it's the projection of evil. I am not evil. I'm a righteous, innocent victim. You are evil. I am love. You are hate. So after 100 years of depth psychology, that is the study of unconscious mental processes, in Freudian psychoanalysis and in Jungian analytic psychology, we have the possibility of incorporating a saner understanding of hatred into politics. But this opportunity has been missed totally. And of course, the depth psychologists themselves have colluded in that. There's very little work, although there were some interesting works by psychoanalysts in the early days along these lines. And in one of Derrida's late works, I forget which it is, he points out something very much like this, that after Freud, everyone should know these things, and everyone pretends to know these things, but they act as if they don't. In other words, the knowledge of these things is denied. So it's denial, and it's not a river in Egypt. I like to say that. There's a lot of resistance to a depth psychological understanding of conflict and violence for many reasons. Well, and among the most important is the reluctance many feel at the prospect of living without animal righteousness. My animal righteousness reassures me. I am love. They are hate. They hate me because of my freedom, because of my success, because of whatever. If not for you, this would be a great relationship. And it's also interesting that criminology is evaded in political science and political thought, and depth psychology is also evaded in political philosophy and political thought. It almost makes you think that the political scientist is the cleric par excellence of the regime, the cleric. And that radicals, people who want to be radicals, just get lost in the nuts and bolts of the economy and the class, etc., etc., etc. Depth psychology sees the self not as unitary and conscious, simply, but as multiple, with some parts of self more or less accessible to consciousness. So Freud is often attacked for reifying the id or the unconscious, but actually Freud is quite clear, if you read him with any amount of care, that the unconscious or the id are labels for processes. They're not things. Unconscious mental processes is what the unconscious means. And in Jungian language, many of these unconscious processes are in the shadow. So I moved to Jung here. In Jungian language, many of these processes are in the shadow. Jung talks about the shadow as an archetype, including those denied or repressed. That is, parts of self that are rendered inaccessible to consciousness because they are unacceptable, hated parts, aspects, or potentials of the self. So the self has aspects. We permit ourselves to talk now about the self as though there were such a thing, yes. That the self has aspects which are unacceptable to itself is something that, again, is characteristic only of human beings. Unacceptable, hated parts of self, which are projected onto the other, which are experienced as not in self, but as in other. The Kleinians were the branch of Freudians who paid most attention to this kind of stuff. But again, their language was so terribly upsetting that they remain a kind of almost cult within the world of psychoanalysis. Who likes to hear that among the first fantasies of the newborn, there may be the desire to bore into its mother's tummy and cannibalize her from within. No, we can do without that. We can, for now at least, we can approach the matter. Hated, parts of self hated as weak, contemptible, shameful, monstrous, gross, dirty, demonic, malevolent, shit, that is evil. Hateful parts of self are hated. So Klein is really good at showing how the infant is so upset by its hatred of its mother that it projects its hatred onto its mother, I don't hate her, she hates me. Some people in NLP, by the way, wanted to invent a new metamodel pattern called reversed referential index. But it's not really a linguistic pattern, so it doesn't fit into the metamodel. Like, not me but you, reversed referential index. And everything you say about me goes back to you, blah, blah, blah. So the denial of the shadow, not a river in Egypt. Okay, I won't say it again. The denial of the shadow goes along with its projection onto the other. The other becomes a receptacle or a container for the denied, shitty aspects of self. And this reminds me of a few years ago, a French diplomat called Israel a shitty little country. I'm not saying he's right or wrong. Maybe France is a great big shitty country and not as good at defending itself either.
But shitty in what way? Maybe he just doesn't care for the hot heat and humidity.
No.
I can't imagine I'd like Israel very much for that reason.
It was political.
Oh.
And there's all kinds of climates in Israel. That's one of the marvelous things about the Holy Land. So if you feel that evil must be punished, then you're going to have a powerful unconscious tendency to punish yourself. For example, by flagellating yourself, crucifying yourself, or rating yourself. Going back to our discussion of self-rating, how much self-rating would be ascribed by depth psychologists to what Freud called the superego. Superego processes self-punishment. Closely related, of course, to ego ideal. Those are processes of projecting unrealizable ideals for which you punish yourself for not being able to realize. And all this self-punishment gets to be too much, so punish the other. It's obvious, rational, but unsane solution. Let's find it in the other and punish it in the other. I once read a book called, I think it was called, by some kind of neo-Freudian, it was called The Fantasy Bond. And he's talking about heterosexual, that is, queer relationships. I adopted this bit of language reform suggested last week by Shannon. So the fantasy bond refers to the relationship that we have with another who is considered actually to be a part of the self. And therefore, such experiences as being let go are taken as a violent assault upon the self, which among men seems to cause a good deal of murder. Right? If you follow the news, it's because they have been murdered. They're taking vengeance. I'm love, she is hate. So the other becomes a receptacle or a container for the denied or shitty aspects of self. I said that. Okay, so if we have this like death drive, it'll be substantially mitigated by punishing evil in the other. Perhaps all the while reassuring yourself that you hate the sin and not the sinner. You hate the Islamist radical and not the Muslim. You hate Zionism and not the Zionist. You hate homosexuality but not the homosexual. In fact, you love the homosexual, so you better be careful. When I was Googling on Debs, I rapidly passed through some comments someone had put somewhere about how all the friends that Debs made in jail, how affectionate he was to people in jail, but he was not a homosexual. I had to put that in there. And so actually there's a chapter in Debs's book, Walls and Bars, where he alludes to the homosexuality in prison, and he found it so scary and horrifying that he could not mention it by name. He said, and those who know will know. You know what I'm talking about. What he was talking about was essentially rape in prison, which happens no less now, I'm sure, than it did then. And according to some reports I've seen, there's proportionately more rape of men and women than there is of women in the society as a whole. I haven't seen any substantial movement of feminists against the rape of men in jail, and I haven't seen any substantial movement of queers against the rape of men in jail. Queers have other political issues with which they can concern themselves these days. Here's where it gets really tricky. If what I'm saying is correct in some sense, obviously not complete, then one would hate the hateful side of oneself. In fact, the Kleinians are so clear on this. And, you know, in some versions of the course, I actually got into Melanie Klein, but the children got to be a little bit too horrified, so I retreated to Jung. One hates the hateful side of oneself. One wishes to experience oneself as solid and strong and loving and loved. This is ego ideal stuff. It's more powerful than almost anything you can imagine. To experience oneself as solid and strong and loving and loved. Not unloving and unloved and weak and contemptible and selfish and evil. You know? The other, that's the other. Selfish and evil and cruel and weak and contemptible, dirty, messy, unreliable and useless. There's no end to it. In this connection, this is how I thought of Madonna. There's seldom a need, contra Madonna, to justify my love, for love is good. Sometimes it has an inappropriate object. But love itself is good, yes. In fact, it is good. It is God. But Satan is hate. God is good, God is love. Satan is hate, and you are Satan. Got it? Now what are you going to do? Humans generally find at the object level the experience of hatred so aversive and so painful that we unconsciously distort it so as to experience it as located in someone else. So since the denial or projection of the shadow is never fully successful, since the shadow frequently breaks through into consciousness, I must justify my hate. I must, modal operator, justify my hate. There's no hate anywhere that I found that didn't justify itself. And that when this is operating well, just appears as justice. And as the fight for justice and as the struggle for justice. And when right-wingers traditionally have accused us socialists of being envious, hateful, etc., it was this side of us that they were aware of. Of course, it wasn't the side of it in themselves that they were aware of. So the projection always has a hook, a sort of real hook on which it can be hung. Yes, some mothers might be a trifle impatient with their infants. There's a hook on which to hang the hatred of the mother as the all-devouring primal monster. Kali. I must justify my hate in terms of self-defense. So we're back to survival. And you know, when we or they justify our hate in terms of self-defense, there is a crucial issue of self-defense in the works. It's not as if I'm making up the need to defend myself. Things have come to such a pass that they do have to defend themselves ourselves. And so hate is compulsory at this level, at this context, not abolished by bumper stickers or by nicey training. I'll soon talk about what kind of training might touch it. But certainly not by punishment and criminalization and delegitimization and monstrification of the other. So what we must do is to blame the originator of evil, the one who started it. My hatred then is righteous, it is defensive, it is hatred of evil, animal righteousness. We are love, they are hate, our troops will bring them love. Our troops will kill the unredeemable scum. I'm reminded of Rick Hillier's line that the job of the Canadian Forces was to kill scumbags, or something like that. And Jack Layton was quiet at that moment. being a good pragmatic social democrat. We kill the unredeemable scum and we convert the rest among them by building schools for their girls or whatever. Or by allowing them to continue to live under our domination. If they're not irredeemably evil. So, we hit bottom so many times here, I don't know which is the true bottom. Maybe this is it. There's no separation between hate and fear. So we hyphenate them. Hate is actually an elementalistic term. Maybe fear isn't. But we certainly can't separate fear out of hate. No fear, no hate. That's what I'm suggesting. And I suggest this little mantra here. Fear, hate, always hyphenate, never separate. Fear, hate, always hyphenate, never separate. The Mobius. I hate him because he fears me. He, I, hate me, him, because he, I, fears me, him, because he, I, hates, because, okay? So hatred always arises out of the fear of a hating other onto whom I have projected my hate. So there is actually a hating other out there. It's not a hallucination. And my hatred always arises, whoever my is now, it's the floating signifier my, I. Hatred always arises out of fear of a hating other onto whom I have projected my hate. Do you think the Nazis didn't think that the Jews hated European civilization? All of our discourses of war, including war on crime, always contain primitive, infantile images of the other, the enemy. I'll bring you a book next time, which is, it's a book called Faces of the Enemy by a neo-Jungian a therapist named Sam Keen, which is just full of images of propaganda posters of all sides and all wars, going back to the Franco-Prussian War of 1880-something, in which the other, the enemy, here, pass this around, in which the enemy is portrayed something like that. I'll get you next week your own private copy of that. That's from World War I. Now, who would not want to destroy this mad brute? Wipe him off the face of the earth. Wipe him off the map. And words like Satan, monster, butcher, baby killer. Imagine sane people marching in the streets yelling, butcher, monster, baby killer, thinking that they're advancing the cause of peace. Nazi, because these days we demonize the demonizer. So when we call someone a Nazi, we're just doing that very same thing. We say, the Nazi is the one who demonizes the other. I am not the demonizer of the other. You are the demonizer of the other. That gets really subtle, but not really. Scapegoat the scapegoater. Kill the scapegoaters. Or, re-educate them. Butcher. Butcher is a favorite. The butcher of this, the butcher of that. Always a place name. The butcher of... War propaganda could not do its satanic work. And do we recognize war propaganda everywhere that it appears? War propaganda could not do its satanic work without images of ugly monsters engaging in vile behavior. Until recently, very prominent were images of slobbering beasts attacking and raping, etc., our innocent, beautiful women, mothers, wives, and daughters, etc. But the emphasis is often on killing children, baby killer, child killer. Examples, cartoon of vulture attacking Iraqi democracy eggs in the cradle, like the Islamist jihadi portrayed as a slobbering vulture attacking the tiny little, cute little child of fledgling Iraqi democracy in the cradle. How often do we talk about fledgling democracies? What is that? What is this little bird which is attacked by the evil vulture? Oh, it's only a cartoon, right? You know that the SS Einsatzgruppen, who were charged with going out there and dealing with the Jewish problem via the machine gun, this was before the geniuses of the final solution came up with the gas chamber crematorium solution. They were shown a film called The Jew Seuss before being sent off to do their satanic work. And The Jew Seuss was about a Jew who was also a rapist. So the Jew Seuss is raping Aryan damsels. We show you this film and then we send you out to solve the problem on the ground. What would war propaganda be without its atrocity stories? True, false, and in between. And how much of what you read about wars of all kinds consist of atrocity stories? Do a content analysis. How much of what you read about wars here and there are atrocity stories? True atrocity stories, false atrocity stories, stories of massacres, atrocities, massacres, atrocities, massacres, atrocities. Hey, there's a sane way of getting into problems of international relations. No justice, no peace. The Iraqi soldier pulling out the incubator wires in the Kuwaiti maternity hospital, you remember that one? That was false. But what difference does it make? So the image of the enemy becomes a personification of evil. Personification of evil. So we take evil, whatever that is, and we make it a person. And we can deal with it as a person. We make it a person or a group of persons. Personification, label of all these things happening down here, which are labeled as evil. Well, it's the image of Satan. The image of Satan has gone through many changes since it was invented 2,000 years ago, but nowadays the image of Satan or the devil is primarily a personification of evil. It's evil personified. So what we're saying here is there is no violence in the bad sense that I'm focusing on. There is no violence without the personification of evil. Even if I'm not shooting you even if I'm not executing you in a prison or in a battlefield, even if I'm insulting you in terms which personify evil, it's the personification of evil, which is the work of the devil. So that is the devil, the personification of evil. Look at the double meaning. The devil is the personification of evil. That's exactly right. That's what the devil is. The personification of evil. Do you get it?